Right. The title is The History of Land Law in England, Part 1.
Part 1 of 100.
You did. So, thank you, Chair, fellow speakers, and guests. If you come back from holiday, if you've had a little holiday in Spain and you're flying back to good old Britain in the, well, sunny day to day, but not all that often, as you fly over the English Channel, entering from Sussex, just above where I used to live, assuming the air traffic controllers in France aren't on strike, which they usually are, if you look down as you come into England, you will notice how well organised and well ordered the countryside is, the landscape, everything. The fields, the way the towns seem to be distributed, everything about it looks neat and well organised, and the planners, David is a planner, the planners might say that's down to us, but that would be a fib. Because planning, as we know, didn't really come into effect until about 1937, and it's been with us ever since then, doing good things, but in fact, it's the law that has played a pivotal part in shaping the English landscape throughout the ages. And law of England has grown gradually, almost invisibly, with only 3 major changes. And they happened in 1066, 1660, which was the restoration of the monarchy after dreary old Oliver Cromwell, and 1925, when a lot of good things happened in English law, particularly for women. So, a little recap, because we need to begin at the beginning. And the Ice Age in Britain only ended, so to say, about 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years, not long, lasted 2.5 million, 12,000 years, the Ice Age sort of dwindled away, and here we are. And what we were left with was a land with a mix of swamps and grassland and fauna and tundra. And Britain in those days was connected to mainland Europe, and I have a little map of that, if I can find it in a moment, by Doggerland, which is still there. You listen to the shipping forecast and you hear Doggerland. I've actually sailed there, and you can see down to the bottom. It's only about 40 feet deep in places. It's quite extraordinary. So it might, if the water recedes, we might be connected to mainland Europe again. Who knows? And if we are, that would be interesting. But no English Channel. I mean, the mainland was accessible to people from mainland Europe. They painted their faces blue. They were what we would call Celtic people. They lived in caves and little settlements, and they made jewellery from little bits and pieces of bone, and everyone was happy. They lived in little settlements like this, made various drinking alcoholic beverages from whatever they could find, and everybody seemed happy. There was council tax to pay. They just lived their little lives, and everyone worked from home. Elon Musk would be furious. There it is. So they discovered all sorts of things. They discovered how to use fire, and meat tasted better if you cooked it, and it might not kill you in those days. And around 6,000 years ago, people started to manage the land. And with the domestication of animals and plants, it fundamentally altered the way that people lived. And I'm sorry if you're thinking, well, we learned all this in junior school, because I need to do this little recap so that you're up to speed. Anyway, lifestyle shifted to these settled farming communities, and in a sense, the age of the uncivilized, brutal savage was over. Though, if you've ever been to a football match with Millwall supporters, you might wonder if much has changed. My point here is that the idea of land ownership emerged. The importance of land ownership emerged amongst people. Now we were settled and people had farms. The idea of land ownership was really significant. And those people did good things. They had social structures. They built Stonehenge and Avebury just up the road. And then about 4,300 years ago, the Bronze Age began, and we had all the revolution that brought, with the ability to have tools and make jewellery and all that sort of thing, and trade networks began. So it began the idea of hierarchical societies, and it began the idea of the elite, and the elite ruling over the common people. That's you and me. And the elite, who later became the aristocracy, worked on the basis that aristocracy means ruled by the best. So they worked on the basis that they were the best. And the elite recognised that land ownership became a fundamental part of developing any community, keeping order amongst the people. So by the time the Iron Age came, there were two main issues that were running here. First of all, the emergence of the elite in a hierarchical society, and the beginnings of a legal system, most of which was destined to protect the idea of land ownership. And then, who came then? The Romans. The Romans came. 54 years after the birth of Christ, the Romans suddenly decided that Britain was worth having, and Julius Caesar arrived from Rome with 2,000 soldiers. So he just conquered the Gauls. We call them the French these days. And troublesome lot. Had a big campaign in Western Europe, and had finally conquered that bit of what we call Brittany, Britannia in those days. And he looked up and he saw this little island beyond, and so he called it Grand Britannia, the bit above Britannia, which was the origin of Great Britain. And then he called Ireland Little Britain. Nothing to do with the TV programme, I don't think. So Julius Caesar claimed to have conquered Britain. Liar, liar, pants on fire, he did not. He stood on the beach when he came, at Ramsgate I think it was, and he declared those famous words, you remember them from school, Veni, vide, vice. Remember that? No? Veni, vide, vice. I came, I saw, I conquered. But the Romans didn't pronounce Latin the way we do. No, they were far, far different. What he would have actually said, if he'd been standing beside the great man at that time, he would have said, Veni, vidi, vici, which doesn't have the same street cred really, does it? Sounds like something out of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when you say it like that, doesn't it? But never mind, he never got further than the River Thames, and so he went home, he went back to Rome, and then he came again the next year, and did the same thing, bashed the living daylights out of the local population. I suppose it was what's called these days a special military operation. But he went back to Rome, and 10 years later Emperor Claudius invaded and finished the job. So 60 years after that, that famous woman, do you remember her name, the great leader of the Celtic clans, Boudica, or Boudicca, depending on how you want to pronounce it, she marched on London, managed to gather all the tribes together, and the tribes at that time were sort of like this. Little tribes, the Picts were up in Scotland, my ancestors up there. She was from the Eretti tribe, and she managed to organise them all, which was a fantastic piece of organisation for anyone in those times. And she conquered London, and she slaughtered a lot of Romans, and then the Romans got really fed up and smashed the living daylights out of her, because the Romans didn't mess about, and they had the best killing machine there's ever been. So what did the Romans do for us at that time? Well, advanced engineering. They brought architecture, governance, currency, law and order, coinage, straight roads, baths, municipal works, the list goes on and on. And then they got fed up and left in the 5th century because it was cold and wet, and Rome had a lot of problems anyway. And so, what happened then? The Germanic tribes came, the Angles, Saxons, and the Jutes. All came over from mainland Europe and settled in this country. And they established their own little kingdoms. And the one that fascinates me is not so much the Anglo-Saxons, which I think a lot of us are, but the Jutes who went and settled in the middle of England, here, around Birmingham and Coventry. And that's why they have persisted with their unusual way of speaking ever since. Have you ever been to Birmingham? Coventry? That's how they speak, and it's quite distinct. You know, that has lasted 1,000 years, quite extraordinary. So anyway, they brought their own little kingdoms, and there they were. By the time the Romans left, by 800 AD, we had all these little kingdoms. We had West Sussex, we had Mercia, we had the Daneland, because the Vikings had arrived by that time, and we had various other little kingdoms sprinkled around the countryside. And, well, I don't know, the Anglo-Saxon period was marked by the formation of these kingdoms. So the Vikings did a lot for us. We've all got some Viking DNA in us, I'm sure. And remember, English is the language of the Anglo-Saxon, and it's German. And that's important as we go on to consider other things. The injection of Latin and French only came with William the Conqueror, and that brings us up to 1066. So, in a recent television quiz show, a contestant was asked what great event happened in England in 1066 that fundamentally changed the social and political structure of the nation. And he said, England won the Football World Cup. And the presenter said, no, that was 1966, not 1066. So he said, oh, well, was it the rugby? So, William the Conqueror came and conquered England. If a Frenchman ever says to you, you're Belgian, French, it's okay. If a Frenchman ever says to you, the French conquered the English in 1066, you give him puffs a smack in the face. Because William the Conqueror was not French, he was Norman. He lived in Normandy, the land of the Normans. The French had given him a chunk of France to keep him quiet. And he managed to inveigle his way into the French aristocracy by managing some kitchen maid who was the illegitimate daughter of some nobleman.
He was illegitimate as well.
He was indeed. William the Bassett they called him, but he didn't care, because he got his own way over everything. Anyway, he realised the English were not a happy lot. My red light is on, but it's got 5 minutes before the break, and I'm going to keep going. Drift out. So he realised the English were not a happy lot. There was all this violence, there was murder within families, there was all this dispute between all of the kings of these little kingdoms, terrible personal relationships, and endless intrigue. These days we call that EastEnders, but in those days it was called the nobility, and the nobility gradually became the aristocracy. More of that later. Now, I'd like to say a few kind words about William and the 4 great things that he did for England. First, he sorted out the English nobility. He well and truly sorted them out. He promised them land and money. And when they turned up to collect it, he chopped their heads off. There you go. The original severance package. And then he set up a system of taxation that we still have today. A local tax on property, land, caused all sorts of problems, and a national tax on income. If you didn't pay your tax, you got your feet chopped off. That was the basic problem. Of course, modern taxation is different. You don't get your feet chopped off. They only take an arm and a leg these days. But he created a new aristocracy. He took away everything the English owned. He took away everything. You remember the Doomsday Book sitting in the back of the class trying to fall asleep? I should tell you about the Doomsday Book, an incredible piece of analysis of all of the land possessions of England, and he used it to great effect. And he created the new aristocracy of landowners in England, and they were all French. More of the aristocracy in part 2. So if you ever see that Frenchman again, give him the slap in the face again, because most of the titles that we have in the aristocracy are French. Duke, Earl is Viscount, I can't remember anymore for the moment, but they're all French. So one other little thing, I hesitate to say this. Sorry? Marquis, yes, the Marquis is very highly rated, and the Marchioness is the highest rated woman in the country still after the Queen. It's quite extraordinary. You can hold the title of Marchioness in your own right, because most women, in those days, women didn't have any rights. Didn't have any rights at all. The fact is, around that time, women were not regarded as individuals with their own legal rights at all. They were regarded as the property of men, and they could not own land. There, I said it, I'm still alive, but this is dangerous stuff, I know. Well, to put it bluntly, in 1066 and for the 50 years after William, women just had to get on with life. They had no choice. They had no choice about anything. They just had to get on with life. And William's great contribution to equality, he was a great administrator and legislator, was that he took an interest in the women of England. He took a considerable interest in the women. Although he doesn't get the credit for it, William was the first king of England who gave women choice. He gave women genuine choice. He didn't care which side of the bed they climbed in. So if you think that your family has already lived in England, always lived in England, then you're part of the history of England. You've probably got William's DNA and probably some Viking DNA, and you can console yourself with the fact that you are connected to royalty. And if you're connected to royalty, you're connected to the aristocracy. And if you're connected to the aristocracy, you know all about the power of land ownership. And that will be in part 2.